As Francois mentioned, my name is Marcin Ebrugowski. I'm an associate professor at the University of Warsaw. And today I represent not only myself, but as mentioned, also Professor Andrzej Nowak, my mentor and chief narrative scientist at Reimagine Europa. But the work I'm going to present is a work of a larger team. Qualitative analysis was performed by Patrycja Pichnicka, who's also with us today. I hope she will be ready to answer some questions. But we were also supported by a large quantitative team, Szymon Talaga, Mikołaj Biesaga, and Anna Boros. We also have a separate team working on possible applications of AI to do narrative work, but the results of the work I'm presenting today are still obtained using more trusted and old-fashioned technology. It was a really quick project. In 18 months, we were asked to take a closer look at three very different topics in public debate. And today my task is to give a brief overview of the complete results. So I had to be very selectable, not to bore you for 3 hours. I try to limit myself to less than 60 minutes, but still there are a few things I'm really excited to share with you. So first, I will start with a very brief introduction of the theoretical background that served us while performing the Nodes project. And I will try to share with you some insights on our point of view of the relationship between polarization and public discourse, especially disinformation. Then I will show you a general outline of the Nodes narrative methodology we've applied to the three topics. And then I will only share one most interesting, from my point of view, finding per topic. So I won't repeat the whole results we obtained on climate, COVID, and migration, but instead I will focus on one particularly interesting thing per each topic. So let me start with the theoretical background and with asking the question that has been a starting point for us in Nodes. So when we're thinking about climate change, or COVID, or especially migration, we very often tend to think in terms of the enemy. Like if, like me, you're very concerned with the climate change, you may think that climate is your enemy and we need to do everything to stop the change, or the virus could be perceived as the enemy. The problem is that when we took a closer look into the public debate surrounding all these very ardent matters, we realized that more often than not in the debate itself, the enemy was not climate, but the other party, the climate skeptics, or not the virus itself, but the anti-vaccination movement, and the other way around. For the anti-vaccination movement, the mainstream media and pandemic alarmists were perceived as an enemy. So very quickly, we have realized that from the narrative point of view, one of the central issues to solve before we will be able to meaningfully address the problem itself is the structure of the debate. And let me show you why polarization is such a powerful, paralyzing tool. So we are wired in the way that encourages us to conformism. You're probably familiar with this famous experiment when they have invited some people and tricking them that they're taking part in an optical experiment, and then they were showing them lines, and two of these lines, line 1 and line C, were obviously the same length. But then they asked which two lines are the same length, and the first participant of the experiment said A, not C. Then the second participant said A, not C. Then the third participant said A, not C. The trick here was that the first three participants were secretly collaborating with the researcher and giving an obviously false answer. But then when it came time for the fourth participant, the real random guy from the street, he or she would say, it's A, despite the C being obviously the same length. This is a famous experiment by Ash showing that in a group situation, we're very prone to conformism. And during the debriefing after this experiment, people were saying, no, I didn't just say that because I thought of being ridiculed or something like that. I really saw that this is an optical illusion and that the line A was really the same length. So the conformist bias was so strong that it even affected the way they perceive reality. So whenever we are in situation of in-group conformism, we are very strongly pressured to agree with other people. The more similar we perceive them, the more we feel prone to agree. The more identity-based the situation is, when we create a sense of we, the more prone we are to agree. So we start to be very offended by any opinion that disagree with the general opinion of the group. And we are very prone to confirmation bias. So we only look for information that confirms what we already know. We reject all the outside information. We treat it as an identity threat. It makes a lot of sense when you think about it. So when our ancestors were roaming vast plains of Northern Africa, it makes a lot of sense that when someone cried, "Watch out, crocodile," you would start running, not investigating. Well, maybe it's not a crocodile, maybe it's just a log that looks like a crocodile, maybe it's a friendly crocodile that we could, be friends with. If you had this kind of non-conformist genes in Paleolithic time, you probably didn't pass them further to your children because you were eaten by a crocodile. This is probably why there weren't many scientific researchers back then, because it's our task always to ask too many questions. So in-group conformism make a lot of sense. In a situation of threat, alarm, we follow the group, and then back home, we start resonating, well, maybe it wasn't a crocodile after all. But in a contemporary world, when minority voices, the strong opinions may very quickly become this cry, crocodile, crocodile, and we are all prone to in-group conformism, this creates a very dangerous bias, especially when we add to it another situation. So when we have very strong mainstream in-group conformism and a new small group appears, this small group can say radical, even ridiculous things and build their own identity on another value, which is non-conformism. So when everybody agrees it's a crocodile, if you find 1, 2, 3 people who agree with you it's not a crocodile, you can create a strong rebellious group. And psychological research shows that a very interesting phenomenon occurs. The more the rebellious group is growing, the stronger they start to feel their own in-group conformist pressure. So we have these wonderful studies of anti-vaccination movement when initially very, very different people were put together in the anti-vaccination movement. A mother that had very reasonable concerns about safety of combined vaccines. Maybe it's too much at the same time, maybe the calendar should be changed. And totally crazy conspiracy theorists that claimed that vaccines contain microchips that will change you into a cyborg and this kind of science fiction stuff. And what happened, as the cited here research by Matthew Hornsey and his collaborators shows, very quickly, this non-conformist group starts to experience what may be called a non-conformism. So we are so separated from the mainstream group, from them, that any differences in our camp start becoming insignificant. And we start to agree with people with whom we would never agree in other situation. And the more these two groups grow, the more we approach the most dangerous situation, the situation of stalemate, when the public debate is roughly equally divided between two groups that both experience extremely strong nonconformism, so the rebellious attitude towards the other group, so they have a very strong sense of enemy, and they both experience the maximal vector of in-group conformism, so confirmation bias and ignoring everything that may threat our in-group identity. This is a situation that an Italian scientist, Giovanni Sartori, called polarized pluralism. So we have a choice. It's not like, a totalitarian regime. It can be either A or B, party A, party B, pro-climate, anti-climate, pro-vaccine, anti-vaccine. But the situation is so polarized that all the mechanisms that exist are just like in very strong totalitarian regimes. No debates whatsoever, no dialogue, and what's worse, no possibility of really solving the problem. So the issue here is how to depolarize the debate and enable dialogue without admitting that, well, we don't actually know if there is a global warming or not because there are scientific evidence on one side. We don't actually know whether vaccines work or not because there are scientific evidence on one side. It's not about diluting the scientific truth and moving away from a fact-based approach. On the contrary, the only effective way of convincing people that now represent disinformation, anti-scientific views, is to create this kind of bridges to enable them to be convinced and to reduce the polarization between two groups, even if we feel that we are right and they are wrong, especially if we feel so. So there is this experiment that really inspired me when I read it. It is an experiment that asked directly, how can we depolarize a very polarized debate without aiming at uniformity? So our goal is not to create uniquely minded European society when everybody are marching to the same drum. On the contrary, the results of this experiment shows us that the way points in totally different direction. The clever experiment conducted by Kugler and Coleman was based on creating pairs of people who very strongly disagree on one of America's most polarizing topic, let's say gun control. They would put in one room a person who's very pro-gun control and a person who says that gun ownership is a basic freedom. And they would test these pairs with different briefings. So one pair would get one-sided briefing. So the pro-gun person would get even more pro-gun information, and the anti-gun person would get even more anti-gun information. The result, easy to guess, the polarization is very high, and they aren't able to write any joint statement. So they don't see any common ground. So Kugler and Coleman tested the obvious opposite of that. They have given people a two-sided briefing. So some of the anti-gun people got anti-gun and pro-gun information, and the pro-gun people get also facts and opinions that supported both sides. And the result of this experiment is pretty surprising because it creates even potentially higher polarization. When people who are very strongly involved in polarized debate got more information supporting the other side, they get even more defensive. They find all the possible reasons not to believe that. But then Kugler and Coleman came up with one more idea, and they created what may be called a multi-sided briefing. Let's show these people that there is no pro-gun and anti-gun, that there are actually many narratives, many stories, that some people cherish the spirit of the Old West and American freedom. The other people are all about security, and having a gun is about protecting your family. Other people are for freedom, that deciding whether you want to have a gun or not to have a gun, it's a matter of freedom. And they have created like 12 different stories that were pointing on different pros and cons about guns, and gave this kind of briefing to these pairs. And the result was stunning. We hate this kind of situation in science because it's very difficult to report it, but 100% of pairs that were given this multi-sided briefing were able to sign a joint statement. So I still don't agree with this guy, but I feel that we share a lot in common. I really appreciate his admiration for freedom. I really appreciate how concerned she is about her children. By the way, I'm also concerned about my children. So we have a lot in common. And this is the approach that is at the very heart of our narrative methodology. What if we started depolarizing the debate, not from communicating, not from talking and saying, well, do this, do that, but from carefully listening to many different stories that are there to create something that maybe compared to this kind of depolarizing multi-sided briefing, but for the whole society. And the idea here is that in some cases, the very act of increasing complexity, so showing, okay, this is not or either, this is not pro-climate or anti-climate, this is not pro-vaccine or anti-vaccine, but it's a multidimensional situation when we are talking about freedom, about security, about children, about future, about transparency. And I know that most of you are science communicators. I try to be one myself. And the first rule in science communication is keep it simple. The simpler, the better, usually. But this is an interesting case when actually making matters at least a little bit more complicated may lead to changing attitudes and redefining the very shape of debate from us, them, yes, no, pro-climate, anti-climate, towards, okay, so there are different values and we can position ourselves on many spectra and see some shared values. So let me now show you how this translated to a particular methodology we applied during the Nodes project. As it's been already mentioned by our host, Francois, Nodes is a large consortium by many partners. Today, I will mostly refer the work done by our group at Reimagine Europa, but the work would be impossible without a very close collaboration with Sotrender that gathered data for us, and Science Feedback that was very closely collaborating with us, both in creating corpora of data and in analyzing disinformation. The other partners were conducting parallel studies so that we were able to compare what we see on Facebook data with what's happening on larger corpora of data in Twitter or Mastodon. This is a part of the results. Even more, we will share in the final report. As it has already been mentioned many times, in just 18 months, we were asked to deal with 3 very different topics. So from time to time, these research projects look like one of these crazy European tours that Americans got, that every single day you wake up in different European country and you see a lot of landmarks, but then your driver beeps and you need to get back to coach and you wake up in another city next day. So I really wish we had more time to elaborate on each of these topics, because I really believe that there are hidden gems still there underneath the surface we're able to scratch. But at the same time, this is a European pilot project. So we lay the foundation, and then I hope next research groups will be able to build on what we have created in terms of both infrastructure, know-how, and the results. So the method we have used was a compromise between trying to see a very general picture and looking at a big data perspective, and having some very precisely defined corpora to conduct some representative quantitative analysis. So for each topic, we would start for a small inquiry in big data, including GDELT or Google Trends or some basic tools that enable us to see what were the main topics, what were the main trends, how does the popularity of main keywords change in time. But this was only scratching surface. I will show you some of these results also today. Then, using also the help from our friends in Science Feedback, we would create large corpora of long text. We were omnivorous at this stage of research, so we wanted everything. Blog posts, professional press, amateurs, scientists, longer text, sometimes shorter text, to create a general map, what's there in the narratives, not to omit any margins. And then we would create a very precisely crafted corpus of Facebook data. We would monitor different sources in different countries. That would give us a representative sample of the mainstream debate. And then by annotating this group of posts, we will be able to see how the popularity of different narratives change in time, how they interact with each other, what are the political alignments of different narratives, are there any interesting differences between countries, how do they change in time? And from this quantitative analysis, we can go to recommendations that I will share with you today. So to sum it up, we have created this kind of narrative maps for 3 topics and applied them in 5 countries: Poland, Spain, France, Ireland, and UK, using 40 to 100 Facebook sources per country, which in total gave us over 35,000 of manually annotated posts. And Patricia is today with us. She can share with you how extremely painful it was to dig through 35,000 Facebook posts, many of them sharing really wild conspiracy theories, the right-wing parties, left-wing parties, everything. It was really an excruciating job. But as a result, we were able to create this kind of narrative maps for every divisive issue. And this is basically what Kugler and Coleman created in these experiments. So instead of saying climate, yes, no, vaccines, yes, no, migrants, yes, please, no, thank you, we would turn a divisive issue into 5, 6, 7 different narratives, sometimes then trying to group them in some narrative stances, so bigger camps, but still focusing not only on differences between these narrative stances, but also, crucially, on the internal differences to show these people that, well, you may feel a part of this bigger group, but look, you have a lot of differences with a lot of representatives of this group. So this is something that is proven to work to reduce this conformity bias. What's more, we try to find these narrative bridges, so shared values between different camps. And for example, here, narrative 1 is most similar to narrative 2, and in a general view, they're perceived as one. But we can see that narrative 1 shares a value with narrative 4 and narrative 5. So if our goal would be to convince a people from narrative 1 to change his or her point of view, we know where to look for a starting point. So this was the general theoretical part, but I believe it's much easier to understand this kind of stuff working on examples. So I immediately jumped to our results from the climate debate to show you not only how the narrative sound like, but also how they look like. Because one of the first thing we have realized is that the narratives that shape our world, narratives that organize collective perception of the most important issues, are not built mainly of words, but images are equally important. And this is the first narrative, very strongly climate skeptical narrative, that says that the main problem of our world is not a changing climate, is a group of radicalized fanatics who want to change everything in our world because they have believed in this new religion or ideology that is called climate. And as you can see, this narrative is built around images of total control, deep state, totalitarian regimes, but also it combines images of climate activism with the terrorism, with totalitarian state. My favorite point is the one about worms and bugs. This is very popular, for example, in my country. I'm from Poland. And the idea that the climate activists want to come here to Poland and take our favorite pork chop and replace it with bugs is a very strong motivator for people to decide on anti-climate policies. They want to take our pork chop, they want to take our ovens, they want to take our diesel cars and radically change our life. So this is a story that says we like what we have, we don't want to change it, and a radical group of people want to change our world. But we have also very different stories about climate there, also skeptical. Another story we've seen, and Patricia maybe you would like to later elaborate on that, but this is very strongly connected also to Russian influence, and this narrative is very popular outside Europe, is a story that the green policies are actually a new form of colonialism. And this is a narrative that starts in a totally different point. They don't say we love our life now. This is a narrative that say we hate our life now. We need to change. But green policies are a powerful tool from the rich to block the change in the life of the poor by banning cheap energy, by banning cheap cars, by banning cheap nutrition food. There is also another story that says we're not into conspiracy. We're not into criticism of the Western culture. We are into mathematics. So let's sit down, count carefully, and look whether the change is really so big. Can we afford it? Maybe there are better things to do with our money. And there's also a very popular narrative, a narrative that does not involve very strong emotion. This is actually a narrative that says, we need to get rid of emotions, sit down and count money. Narrative number 4. This is the narrative, by the way, that official communication of European Green Deal tends to use, that companies that invest a lot in CSR and ESG tend to use. This is a narrative saying we can overcome the crisis, we can use technologies to solve the problems, and by the way, we can also use it as an opportunity to create innovation, to grow. And as you can see at these pictures, this is a narrative about systemic thinking. So all these jigsaw puzzles, moving them, control, virtual interfaces, green energy. This is a top-down narrative saying, don't worry, we have you. Systemic decisions made by politicians and big companies can save the world. But we need to invest in that also. There is another narrative, also very popular, you're probably familiar with that, saying that basically we're dealing with an apocalypse. The apocalypse is coming, the end of the world as we know it. The changes are irreversible. It's probably already too late. But even if it's not too late, this is not a hopeful narrative. This is the narrative that says we maybe have a month or a year to do, but we won't act because the politicians are corrupt. The inertia is too strong. And this is the narrative created around all these images of scorched earth and melting ice caps. But there's also another story, the story that says, sorry, I'm allergic to melting ice caps. There is a narrative that says that climate is not a primary problem. Climate is a secondary problem. Climate is a result of capitalism and greed and capitalism and our tendency to look for profit everywhere is the main problem. So we should not aim at climate directly. We should aim at rich people and capitalism. And in order to save the world, we need to change the system first. And last but not least, an optimistic narrative saying that we don't have to wait for politicians. We don't have to wait for big companies. On the contrary, change starts bottom up. If we join our forces, if we work together we can change the world, and the change starts with common people. So to sum it up, we have 7 narratives. 3 of them the dystopian one, the progressive one, and let's not panic, are skeptical. They all share the basic assumption that the climate change is not real or it's much smaller than expected. We have two optimistic narratives saying, yes, we can do that either by top-down or by bottom-up action. And there are two narratives that are very pessimistic and share a lot of apocalyptic views, but one of them is directly pointing at the climate change, the other one indirectly by blaming capitalism. And you may ask yourself, what's wrong with my math skills and counting? Why the numbering goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, 5, 6? And it's a great story because it's my mistake. When initially we were working on this narratives, I felt that narrative number 7 is much more similar to narratives 5 and 6. So this is basically a narrative that focuses not on what we should do, but rather on the climate change itself. But then, after creating this map of narratives, we were able to run some numbers on that. And we have actually seen by data that there are 3 main camps, and that narrative 4 and 7 belong together. If a source uses terminology or narratives associated with 4, usually they would also be similar to 7 and not to 5 and 6. So as a result, we have recolored number 7 and moved it to the middle, but to avoid replicating some errors later, we didn't change the number 7 because we would need to carefully change it in all the data and it could result in possible surprises. So this is an interesting situation when we can clearly see how combining traditional qualitative methods with this new digital approach can lead us to seeing new things that we won't be able to see just, by the naked eye. And by the way, when we have an annotated corpus of these narratives, we can see how the popularity of different narratives change in time. So this is, for example, a chart showing climate debate in the UK. You can see in the very middle of a chart, there is this huge spike. It's the climate summit, COP26. So during the COP, everybody talked about climate in the UK, but the existing tools would, following keyword analysis, for example, would enable us to see that there was a spike, but we are able to see something more. We are able to see which narratives were prevalent. And we can see that there is a large spike in the blue narrative. So this is the narrative that summit used to talk about itself. So yes, we can do that. We met together and the president of this country said this and president of that country said that. They pledged this, they pledged that. And this is basically the narrative. We can overcome the crisis. But on top of that, we have this spike of apocalypse narrative reminding us what climate crisis is about, an even larger spike of the rebellion against greed, which basically says, rich people met again, flying the private jets and helicopters to talk about the future of climate. And this is like ironic response, negative response to the summit. So people who would see it without narrative analysis would say, whoa, the summit was very positively reported. We've seen a huge spike of interest in climate. But when we have narrative analysis separated here, we can clearly see that the basic response was the ironic response. There was a negative response saying, no, we're not going to change anything. This is just, politicians doing their usual political job and not really changing the world. By the way, you can see that the yellow narratives, the strongly anti-climate, often conspiracy narratives, are very small on our chart. This can be misleading. These results do not tell us that the disinformation does not exist and the anti-climate movement does not exist. But we need to be aware that what we've monitored is a very mainstream part of the debate. This shows us that even radical right-wing parties and radical right-wing media on Facebook debate, because of many things, also because of the internal mechanism of Facebook, are not able to share these narratives. So in order to find them, to analyze them better, we need to expand to different places. Like, for example, Twitter, they are still, or now known as X, they are still thriving on this platform and in other places. So I don't want to, silence the fears here. Disinformation is still there. Just the tool we are using is not monitoring the whole debate. But when we zoom in into different political parties, we already see that in the extreme right, even in this mainstream debate, the popularity of these skeptical narratives is very strong and growing. So if Europe is going to shift more into this direction, we may easily experience in the next coming years also a large spike of this anti-climate debate in the mainstream media, which now is not the case. So let me come back to the idea of narrative bridges that I shared with you at the beginning. If you remember narratives 1 and 5, these are the most polarized narrative we can imagine. Number 1 says crazy activists want to change our life, want to ruin our tradition, want to destroy our security, want to ruin life for our children. And narrative number 5 is saying we need to do something because climate change is going to destroy our tradition, our traditional food, crops, and so on, destroy the continuity of our life, destroy the future for our children, and destroy our security. So what's fascinating is that they share a lot of values. They are the most polarized narratives, but at the same time, they have surprisingly large common ground. So this is, for example, a very clear recommendation how to communicate to these people. So if I meet a person, which happens very frequently, who is very deeply into narrative number 1, saying, yes, crazy activists are going to take my pork chop and my diesel car, the good starting point is not, hey, you are stupid. This is never a good starting point. Look at the charts, the climate is changing and we are in deep trouble. But my response is, yeah, and now we also have no snow for Christmas. I'm a traditional guy like you. I have 3 children. This is true, by the way. And the whole winter, they are like, Daddy, we want to go skiing. We want to play on snow. Where is snow? And, I'm from Poland. Polar bears and penguins and stuff like that. It used to be snow all the time. And now there's no snow throughout the whole December. So I totally share the feeling of the climate skeptical person. Someone is taking something from me. But I don't think that the snow in December was actually taken by the bureaucrats in Brussels. So maybe we can still agree that we want more traditional values, the well-known plants and foods on our Polish tables. But at the same time, maybe Brussels is not to blame. Maybe there is something really serious going on. And if we really like Polish tradition, if we really like Polish cuisine, if we really like our childhood memories and we want to preserve it for our children, addressing climate change may be a reasonable thing to do. So this is reshaping the message by building bridge and starting from listening. So what are your values? Why are you concerned? Why do you hate climate policies right now? And by the way, this is exactly what unfortunately didn't happen with the European Green Deal. The farmer protests in many countries were articulating things that were actually in line with European Green Deal, like protecting traditional farming, traditional crops, medium and small farms, moving away from the Americanized model, and many different things. But the communication was done in totally different narratives. So the farmers felt that European Green Deal is something hostile, alien. Another example, just very shortly, we can also see a lot of interesting bridges between narrative 1 and 6. So if someone is really focused, no, I don't care about snow. I don't even care about traditional food. What I care is my freedom. Someone is limiting my freedom and we need to rebel because we are real rebels. I would invite them to join narrative number 6. So indeed, I also feel that large multinational companies and oil industry are limiting our freedom to some degree. And for their profit, they are creating a world which is unsustainable, which is just for a small minority, and so on and so forth. We have a whole network of this kind of bridges showing how all the different narratives are actually linked by very deeply shared values. But unfortunately, today I want to share the experience of waking up in different European town each morning. So I will not elaborate in that. Instead, I will show you some interesting things we found out about COVID debate, because this was by far the most surprising narrative maps we encountered. Instead of finding two camps, pro-vaccine and anti-vaccine, we very quickly realized that the COVID debate is shaped by a classic 2x2 matrix. So people in the upper part of the diagram believe that the government should be strong and the change should be top down. People in the bottom part of the diagram believe that the government should be weak and the change should be done by people and the people themselves should decide and take care. The people on the left side of the diagram believe that basically government is weak and we need to act together as a collective. And people on the right side believe that the government is strong, but people should act by themselves. And if they trespass, they should have several severe consequences and harsh punishment. This looks complicated right now, but let me just describe you very shortly these four narratives, and you will immediately see how they fit a complete picture. So in narrative number one, very popular narrative in every country we research, the story goes like, oh no, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and this is a situation when we really need stabilization and order, and we need a strong government. Unfortunately, we are ruled by a bunch of morons, and our government is terrible, and they are unable to do anything right. Lockdowns, terrible. Too soon, too late, too small, too big, you name it. Vaccines, not well tested, too late, and so on. Number two starts with a similar premise. Oh no, we are in the middle of pandemic and we need stabilization and order more than ever. And luckily, we are your government and we are in control. So as you can easily guess, these are the narratives favored by government parties in all the countries, saying, we will take care of you. We will impose the necessary measures. They may be harsh, but don't worry. We keep you covered. But if you will trespass, if you break the rules for quarantine, if you don't vaccinate, the consequences will be very severe. On the other hand, we have the bottom quadrants of the diagram. Number three says, oh no, we're in the middle of the pandemics and the government will never deal with it. Luckily, we, the people, can do it. So let's create forms of bottom-up solidarity. Let's help our neighbors. Let's vaccinate ourselves without any mandatory requirements from the government, and we can solve the problem together. And number four, this is the conspiracy narrative saying the government should not interact, but they do. We have a strong government that has no idea what they are doing, and they are limiting our freedom. They are imposing ridiculous laws. They are forcing us to get vaccinated with untested vaccines, and we need to rebel. So this is the matrix based on two factors, whether you want government to interact and whether you believe your government is strong or weak. So number four, don't want government to interact, but believes that government is strong. So they are unhappy. Number three, don't want government to interact and they believe government is weak, so they are happy. Number one, want government to interact, but believe the government is weak, so they are unhappy. And number two, basically, is the government. They want government to interact and they believe government is strong, so they are happy. Number 5 and 6 narratives that are below are interesting cases when we had stories about how virus spread or how a spike protein works, or in number 6, how dolphins are back to Venice or other things, but they do not create a strong feeling of pro, anti, and so on. They are neutral narratives. So first thing we've discovered analyzing the debate on COVID is that, like the pandemic itself, the informational space in the pandemic had different waves. So, for example, at the beginning, you can see this small pinkish spike on every chart. This is the place where people were looking for general information. Okay, what's that? What's COVID? Is it dangerous? Should I be concerned? Is it already here in Europe, in Poland? Then we have another spikes, the blue and the green one. These are places where people were asking about lockdowns and masks. So is lockdown good or bad? Should I be afraid? Should I stay home? Should I break the quarantine, whatever? And the same with masks, do they work? And then the huge consecutive 4 or 5 spikes are vaccine debate. You see that in different countries, it looked different. For example, in France, there was a growing tendency. People were more and more interested and concerns about vaccine. In Poland, for example, the last diagram here, when vaccine appeared first, there was a huge controversy, but then people stopped caring so much, and the interest faded. So what we can see is that there were actually few waves of informational and disinformational campaigns concerning different topics, general information, masks, lockdowns, vaccines, and sometimes other. The existing literature on narratives on COVID said, well, so we have different narratives. We have narrative A about general virus, narrative B about masks, narrative C about lockdowns, narrative D about vaccines. Our research suggests that it's other way around. We have a stable narrative matrix that then get attached in a very similar form or exactly the same form to different debates. So for example, let's talk about lockdowns. If you are in narrative number 1, you would say, yes, we really need lockdowns. Lockdowns are great, but our government know nothing about lockdowns. They impose them too early, too soon, or too late, or they are forbidding going to the forest. This was a huge case in Poland. While to the forest is great for your health, and so on and so forth. Narrative number 2, pro-government narrative, would say, lockdowns are necessary. We are doing lockdowns. Please follow the rules, or you will be severely punished. Number 3 says, no, we don't maybe really need lockdowns. Let's make a responsible bottom-up policies. Let's self-quarantine, let's stay home, let's take care of our neighbors. And number 4 would say, lockdowns. This sounds like a dark science fiction. They don't allow you to leave your home, maybe forever. They will transform you to virtual reality, whatever comes next. Let's break the rules. Same happened to vaccines. So people in narrative number 1 would say, yes, we really need vaccines, but is our government really capable of delivering us best vaccines in the correct time? Number 2 would say, yes, vaccines are coming, please do vaccinate, and so on. Number 3 would say, we don't need government, let's do a bottom-up queuing for vaccines. And number 4 would say, vaccines are evil, and you should not be vaccinated, especially not a mandatory policy for that. And by the way, whenever a new, even a niche thing appeared, like, I know, contact tracing app, people would immediately know what to think about contact tracing app, because as our research showed, they would use the old narrative matrix. They don't have to really understand how contact tracing app works, but they would just say, okay, I'm number 4. So my idea about contact tracing app will be, this is violation of my privacy. And now the government wants to trace all the people with whom I met. Or if you're number 3, they would say, yes, let's make a bottom-up action to install these apps and do the open source contact tracing app and not wait for government, and so on. By the way, this also applies to more abstract issues, like, is European Union doing a good job during pandemics? So number 1 would say, yes, we need European Union more than ever. It's a pity that European bureaucrats are not capable of doing this. Number 2 would say, European Union this is us basically. We provided you with vaccines. Please follow the rules. And number 4, again, would say that this is another reason to leave the European Union, because now they are interacting also with our everyday life, hiding under the cover of pandemics. And by the way, I'm not expanding the narrative bridges thing here because I only said one interesting thing per topic, but on this diagram, we've seen this one very strong narrative bridge that worked as a slide on a children's playground. So a lot of people, a lot of channels were starting in narrative number 1, saying, oh, we need more stabilization, but we cannot trust our government. And they ended up saying, is this pandemic really real? If our government is so incompetent, maybe they made up the pandemic, or they're not aware of the real scale of the pandemic. So number 1 was like a gate drug for more severe COVID disinformation. Last but not least, the topic of disinformation, the topic of migration, very prone to disinformation. Without further ado, this is the map. And we can see that there are 7 main narratives. 3 of them are pro-migrant, 1, 2, and 3. 3 of them are very strongly anti-migrant, 5, 6, 7. And we have narrative number 4 that initially looked like a very neutral narrative. So number 1 says, we are human, first and foremost, and they are human. And these are human beings suffering that need our empathy and solidarity. And look at all these overcrowded boats, look at all these camps, look at all these people waiting at our borders. We need to let them in, we need to help them, we need to share our resources. On the other hand, you have a symmetrical copy, but negative copy of this narrative in number 4, saying, look at all these boats, look at all these camps, look at all these people at our borders. These are invaders. These are people who are different than us, who come in huge quantities to our countries, and we are under siege. We are invaded by a hostile army. Narrative number 2 says, look, these people are already here inside. They are very similar to us. They need help in integrating. They need help in becoming part of our communities. And by the way, whenever we help them, whenever we reject xenophobia and nationalism, they are a very valuable member. They become very valuable members of our society. We have a mirror image of this narrative saying, yes, these people are already here and we are doing a lot to help them. But the result is that they still do not integrate. They commit a lot of crimes. They don't accept our values. So you see how these 2 debates are built very symmetrically. Narrative 3, which was, by the way, surprisingly small in popularity. This was narrative saying, well, by the way, whether we like it or not, we need migrants for economy because they take jobs that are very important for our economy and for business to develop. We need more migrants. And the mirror image of this is migrants are stealing what's ours. They are taking our jobs, or they are taking our social security benefits, or they are taking our housing. You wait for years and years to get to a doctor, and then a Middle Eastern or a Ukrainian migrant comes to your country, and he or she gets served first. And number 4 is a neutral narrative saying, we have a huge challenge. How can we regulate it to make the situations bearable for different groups? So it looked like we had 3 different camps, pro, anti, and neutral. But when we introduced some tools of quantitative analysis, realized, this is a case on data from Ireland, that there are actually only 2 camps. When someone uses one of the anti-narratives, the probability that the source would use another anti-narratives is super high, but the same sources would almost never use any of the positive or neutral narratives. But the neutral narrative is sticked, is glued to the positive narratives. So actually, if you are anti, you're 100% anti. You will never use the neutral narrative. But if you are pro, you will sometimes use also the neutral narrative. So the neutral narrative is only masking as neutral, is actually part of the pro camp, which makes this debate, and this is the interesting thing about it, the most polarized of all three debates. And when we try to find narrative bridges, we only found narrative bridges that worked vertically, not horizontally, making this in-group pressure, making this confirmation bias and the tendency for conformism even stronger. So for example, narratives 1, 2, and 3 are all built on solidarity, empathy, feeling that migrants are similar to us. Narratives 5, 6, and 7 are all built on different senses of security, stability, sovereignty, and the feeling that migrants are radically different from us. So in this case, depolarizing the debate by using narrative bridges would probably be impossible because there are virtually no shared values. But we have different methods. For example, both narratives 1 and 5 share this global perspective. So they are very narrow in time, like now something is happening. This moment is a special moment, but they focus on global situations. So this is something they share. So we are both concerned about what's going on now. We need to act now. And by the way, this is already a value, but it is hidden. A value saying we need to change something. We need to act right now. These are both to some degree anti-conservative narratives saying we need to do something. And narratives 2 and 6, on the other hand, they both share the long temporal horizon and narrow spatial horizon. So I'm not interested in what's happening there. I'm interested in what's happening here in my community, in my small town, in my neighborhood, my street, but not only now, what will be tomorrow, next week, in 5 years, in 10 years, when these children that just came grow up. How can we help them, or how can we protect our children, and so on and so forth. So there are still methods of creating these bridges, but just not by directly linking values. And because these narratives were so strongly divided into two camps, we were able to observe some disturbing phenomena. For example, in Poland, a totally different group of narratives was attributed to Ukrainian migrants than to Middle East migrants. Ukrainians were, at least at the beginning, very strongly viewed through the lens of how similar they are to us, that they are victims of Russian aggression, we need to help them, while Middle East migrants were very often perceived as hostile, different, alien. We don't know about the wars. We don't care about the bombs that fall there because we don't really understand the situation. So these two groups were perceived in one country through totally different lenses. And this is analysis that we've done on a very, very, very large corpus of articles using GDOLT project. And what you can see here is that we had this hypothesis that it works very strongly in Polish, but also in other languages. There is a neutral/negative words called migrant. Migrants can be neutral, but also in negative context. And there is a positive word, refugee, uchodźca, which is always only in positive context. So when we took a look at how public debates talked about migrants and refugees, we can see you can see at the beginning, before this huge spike, there are 3 lesser spikes, and these are the narratives about migrants from Africa and Middle East crossing illegally the Polish-Belarus borders, and the society is asking what to do with them. So you can see that the first spike is both red and blue. There are 2 different narratives. One narrative saying, my God, there are people fleeing war, we need to help them, the red one. and the blue ones saying, no, these are some strange people from different culture who are potentially dangerous. And by the way, they are crossing the border illegally. So it's like an attack on our country. And you can see how the public debate is switching to the blue mode. Like at first, red and blue are equal. Then the situation is only interpreted through the blue lens more and more. And the last spike is totally blue. The red side of the debate lost. They become locked as alien different. But then something else happens. Russian invasion on Ukraine. And there is a huge spike of positive narratives saying these are refugees, these are people like us, they're escaping from war, we need to help them. But you can see that later, the society gets more and more tired and the blue narrative starts to prevail again. And when we analyze the well-known case of Russian disinformation, we can very clearly see that the main factor of Russian disinformation was not to create some new stories about Ukrainian migrants. It was just to take the existing narratives that were already there describing Middle East migrants and to copy them, stick them to Ukrainian migrants, to say, you thought Ukrainians are like you, but they are actually like these people from Middle East whom you already rejected. So this is how this kind of narrative gaps become dangerous places where we become vulnerable also for disinformation and propaganda. And let me finish with giving you some more general picture. So what do we get when we put all these topics together? So this is the map for climate. This is the map for COVID. This is the map for migration. And what we get is a lot of colorful boxes, not very legible maybe. So let's reorganize them like this. And you can see that in every debate, there is the freedom narrative saying government is trying to limit our freedom. We need to resist. They want to impose on us migrants or lockdowns or anti-climate measures. They want to censor our freedom of speech. We need to rebel because this is all a part of pan-European global agenda. In every debate, we have this bottom-up narrative saying, let's do something, let's help these people, let's not wait for the government, let's organize. In every narrative, we have the techno-solutionist version. So in every debate, a techno-solutionist version of narrative saying top-down solutions are good, let's regulate it, let's use new technologies. And by the way, this is beneficial for economy. We can even make money on that. In every debate, we have some form of apocalypse narrative saying this is a catastrophe, people are dying, the world is changing radically. By the way, Under Siege #5 is in many degrees also very similar to this narrative. And in climate and migration, we also have this narrative saying, okay, let's get reasonable about that. I'm not anti-climate, I'm not anti-migrant, but just let's talk about money. Can we afford it? Is it a reasonable way to spending our money? Maybe we should do something else with our money. By the way, the fact that we don't see this narrative in COVID shows us how strong the yellow narrative was. It just swallowed the reasonable calculation. And when someone says, okay, let's sit down and reasonably calculate the costs of COVID pandemic, he or she would probably very soon add, and by the way, the virus does not exist and it's all a conspiracy. So this is also an example of the research I've shown you earlier on in-group conformism, that a very strong pressure on the anti-vaccination group make them cluster together even stronger and made this, let's say, reasonable, mathematically oriented group disappear. So if we take a closer look, just one last thing, for example, the yellow narratives, they all say about limiting our freedom, some powerful conspiracy, some censorship. The bottom-up solidarity, they even use the same pictures. This is a bottom-up solidarity narrative for COVID. Look, hearts and colorful hands and superheroes. This is a bottom-up narrative for climate. Hands, hearts, colorful superheroes. This is bottom-up narratives for migration. These are the same pictures, same images. This also shows how when people are very strongly into one topic, they will probably use the same schemes in other topics. And this is very strongly supported by research of Centre National de Recherche Scientifique, our collaborators in the project. David Chavalarias and his group demonstrated that COVID pandemics became a gate drug for climate skepticism, that Twitter accounts that became very popular by negating the virus and spreading anti-vaccination messages later switch to anti-climate messages using, by the way, similar images, because similar images are used trans topics. So this leads us to some main conclusions. And first, let me repeat myself here. The first issue we need to address is polarization, because it makes us trapped in a stalemate. It makes us more prone to disinformation. It makes dialogue impossible. But the polarization does not mean uniformity. Diversity is vital for democracy. Our aim is to increase diversity, to show these different voices, but to enable dialogue between them, because we need a consensus based on different values, not on shaping everyone into one mold. So presenting a spectrum of narratives may be a nice first step to the radicalized debate. So maybe I'm culpable myself. We need to stop using easy labels like anti-vaccination movement, like anti-climate movement, and show that there are actually many different movements and many different people, many of whom have very reasonable concerns. Words are not enough. Images, pictures, diagrams are very important markers of narratives. And by the way, as a result of this analysis, we were able to guess what narrative it is just looking at the color palette of graphics, because they were so diverse. Narrative matrices are more universal than topics. So when people get stuck in thinking in some terms about government, trust, elites, and people, they tend to reproduce, as in COVID case, the same matrix into different topics. And last but not least, general conspiracy narrative, very anti-elitist, anti-government, anti-media, anti-journalist, seems to be the most problematic one. Thank you very much, and back to studio.